Kia ora koutou, Markie here. So I'm talking to a number of different audiences here, if indeed anyone is listening to me, which is always a possibility that I'm speaking into the void. But I did a series a while back on my YouTube channel. I can't even remember the precise title, but I'll look it up before I publish this. Why it's not a good idea to be a psychotherapist. So, and this is going to be part of that series. It's stuff that I wanted to talk about a long time ago, but it's quite complicated, and it's great stuff, it's fascinating stuff, but it's quite kind of complicated to get into, and I tend to be very much in the moment when I'm producing videos. So some of you will be people that have maybe followed that. That's kind of one potential audience. The other will be colleagues from my day job, because I am putting together a presentation on vicarious trauma, and I've only got an hour. I want to get into some of the subtleties of it, but there's not much time to dwell on that. So I thought it would be good to do a video which expands upon that for people that are interested in that side of it, so they're not shortchanged. They can watch this bit of it, okay? And I guess the third audience, I guess there's three potential audiences, people who are coming to this afresh. So this is a standalone video. You don't need to have watched any other of my videos to make sense of this one. But it is part of a series, and there's a playlist, so check in the playlists, and I'll put in the description box exactly what the title of that playlist is, because it escapes me from the moment. So, and the other thing to bear in mind, all three audiences, my channel is completely rough and ready. There is no production value, there's no slickness. I like to say it's all content and no style. Some people say it's no content and no style, but there we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about vicarious trauma, because that does put it into context. So coming from the context of why it's a bad idea to be a psychotherapist, and there's lots of reasons why it's a good idea to be a psychotherapist, by the way. I'm not just doing kind of negative videos, but one of the reasons is it's dangerous. It's a dangerous job. And if you say that, people think you mean, well, you're working with dangerous people. Sometimes, yes. I mean, I've worked in prisons. I have worked with people who are potentially dangerous. Most of the people that have a reputation of being very dangerous have turned out to be really pleasant, nice people. I've worked with some extremely kind of dangerously violent people and found them, just really, really pleasant. But sometimes it can be physically dangerous, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it being psychologically dangerous, okay? And there are the different things, really. So people talk about burnout and compassion fatigue. They are things that happen to therapists. And something different again, but which can contribute to those, is vicarious trauma. So vicarious means on behalf of, and trauma is, I would say, any event any overwhelming event which leads to ongoing negative effects, negative consequences. So usually an event that involves an emotional overwhelm. So I'm whizzing through some of this preliminary stuff kind of quite quickly, really, because what I want to get into is a particular aspect of vicarious trauma. So this is just a little bit of context setting, and this will be a recap for people who have watched the presentation. So what I said in the presentation was, I haven't done the presentation yet, but what I hopefully would have said before any colleagues kind of might venture onto this channel, is there are two kinds of vicarious trauma. There's one which is very kind of conscious and overt, and you know that you're experiencing trauma. Somebody tells you something and you feel immediately or soon afterwards you feel very distressed by it. That's at the conscious mind content level. And then there's an indirect form of it, which leads to more insidious effects. Now this is where we kind of cross over and blur, not blur, that's not a good word, is it? We cross, the subject of countertransference comes into it, because what I'm going to be talking about is countertransference. Okay, so I'm starting to get more specialised. The presentation was about vicarious trauma. We're not focusing on the stuff that makes you feel icky and horrible immediately. We're talking about the subtle stuff where you don't know that you're experiencing trauma. And this is the countertransference side of things. Now, the language that this comes from old Ziggy Freud, who started to look at the mechanics of the unconscious mind. He wasn't the first person to recognise that there was an unconscious mind, but he was the first person to kind of start seriously exploring the mechanics of it. I've got no time at all for people that knock Freud. Yes, he made mistakes, but for crying out loud, the guy was from not the last century, but the century before, and he was the first person to kind of come up with some really useful ideas about this kind of stuff. People say, it's not evidence-based, but these are things that can't be tested in a lab. So they come down to belief in a lot of cases, but having worked with people in the therapy room for a couple of decades, I'm convinced that this stuff is true. Okay. So, I have to say I'm not an expert in the form of therapy based on the theories and the work of Freud, and that's been developed kind of further by kind of post-Freudian people. It's generally referred to as psychodynamic. So Freud's method of working was called psychoanalysis. And then things were developed, and psychoanalysis still exists, and it's a very specific form of treatment, very specific. So never use the word psychoanalysis as a general term for trying to kind of suss somebody out, because that's not what psychoanalysis is. Psychoanalysis is a very prescribed form of psychological treatment. But so the psychodynamic school of psychology, psychotherapy has a language. So I'm not, like I said, I'm trained, my psychotherapy training is integrative. So I've worked on a combination of all the main schools of therapy, including psychodynamic, but I'm not a specialist, okay? So if there's any psychodynamic therapists in here, and you feel that I've got any of this stuff wrong, or maybe I've not explained it well, please be kind of gentle with me, okay? And some of the language that I use will probably come from other schools as well, because I think what the map is not the territory. We're talking about real stuff, okay? And it doesn't matter what you call it, okay? But this is where it comes from, okay? And it's come a long way in terms of different schools of thought and different ideas and different people since then, okay? So what I've I'm looking at something, that's why my eyes are often off to the side. So first of all, and I put this in a particular way. A psychoanalyst or a psychodynamic therapist wouldn't necessarily describe it in quite these terms or divide it into the sections that I have. But I think this is the way that it makes sense to me. Okay, so I'm not trying to be I'm not trying to teach psychodynamic theory here, okay? And I'm not trying to pretend to be a psychodynamic therapist. I'm a therapist who's influenced probably quite a lot by psychodynamic theory. But it's, I don't claim to be an expert in it, okay? In fact, I think all the schools of psychotherapy were influenced by the psychodynamic school, even though the ones that kind of hated it and went the other way, they went the other way because of it. So they were influenced by it. So client transference. Okay, so a couple of terms. I don't particularly like these terms. I find them quite unhelpful in terms of getting your head around things. But so basically, transference and countertransference. Transference is how the client sees you. Okay, and countertransference is any effects that this is my definition of it anyway, any effects that the client has upon you, whether they're conscious or unconscious. And obviously it's the goal of the therapist to try to make all of this conscious, is try to recognise the transference from the client and also recognise the countertransference that they get. So some countertransference is very obvious, stuff like it might be you're working with somebody that's got a body odor problem, and you kind of really dread that when they come in, because it's going to stink your room out and make you feel quite uncomfortable. That's another reason why being a psychotherapist isn't a good idea. But the countertransference is this more subtle stuff. Okay, so I've included this under the heading of countertransference, but I've actually called it client transference. Okay, which sounds confusing, but it will make sense as we go through it. Okay. So what I've written down is the client relates to you, the therapist, as, and I've given some examples of the different ways that they relate. So these are distortions, okay? So they're not relating to the real you as a therapist. This is things that they are projecting upon you, onto you, okay? So rescuer, abuser, parent, lover, victim, etc., okay? So what happens is, particularly with the old school, particularly with things like psychoanalysis, where the therapist removes their personality very much from the room to enable this to happen. And they enable this to happen because when you recognize it, it's very useful information therapeutically. You can use that to help the client. But it happens in all therapy, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you believe in psychodynamic theory or you don't. So what happens is the client will start to, and this usually happens. I said, it doesn't say it happens in every case. A psychoanalyst might disagree with me and say that it does, but often they will start to react to you in the same way as usually someone from their past, okay, or they will start to because even non-psychodynamic therapists don't, as a rule, reveal a lot about themselves. Some do more than others. Some are very, almost secretive. Some are much more open. But generally speaking, the therapy session is always, is 100% for the client. It's not for the therapist to chat or show off or anything like that. So the encouragement is always that you're talking about the client. You're not talking about you. You're not revealing things willy-nilly about you as a therapist. There's whole different kind of theories about self-disclosure and stuff like that. We won't get into that because that's a huge thing. So in any therapy situation, that kind of transference becomes quite easy. Now, if the client sees you as an abuser because you remind them of a previous abusive person, a parent or an abusive partner, what will happen is unconsciously, in terms of their behaviour and their body language and all the unspoken things, they will invite you to respond that way to them. So, for example, so somebody responds to you as their abuser. Sometimes you can experience anger or dislike towards them. If they relate to you as a lover. Now, obviously, and I'm saying this is mainly aimed at non-therapists. So this would be obvious to clinicians in the field that you don't have sexual or romantic relationships with your clients, but your clients don't know that always. And even if they do know that, it's very common for somebody to kind of fall in love or think they've fallen in love with the therapist. So your behaviour, your feelings and your thoughts and your inclination is going to be yanked around by how the client sees you. Okay, and they're not going to tell you how they see you. Sometimes they do, but generally speaking, this is all played out in an unconscious way. But it's like a dance in which it's very difficult for you not necessarily join in, but to find yourself swaying a little bit to the music. And this is why therapists have supervision to unpack all this kind of stuff. When we get into more and more of it, it gets really deep and dark in a minute. So the second part that I've identified here is projection of suppressed, repressed / disowned material. Okay, so I'm not going to get into suppressed and repressed. So both words kind of mean, so suppressed means kind of pushed down. I said I wouldn't get into it, but this is just to touch on it. Repressed means really pushed down. So repressed means you can't remember it at all, but it's still having an effect upon you. Suppressed is that it's kind of there, but it's on the edge of your consciousness. It's in your peripheral vision. So what I've written here, this is from the presentation, through empathy, mirror neurons and processes we don't yet understand. I think it's mainly the latter. And I think these are things that science can't reach. Science can't reach these very nuanced, subjective human experiences. Or it can kind of get to the edges, but it can't. It's not a good tool for exploring everything. It's like science is a great thing, but it's not good for everything. Okay, so science is. I don't know. You could use science. You could try and use science to explore what tastes good. But if you actually want to experience what tastes good, then you're probably better off talking to restaurant critics, not scientists. Okay. So through empathy, mirror neurons, and processes we don't yet understand, I'm not going to explain mirror neurons. That's a whole big thing. We start to experience and often dream about. Dreams are very important in this school of psychology. The thoughts and feelings the client has blocked off. So this is really interesting. So we block stuff off, okay? So as a child, we are sometimes, very often, taught one way or another that certain aspects of ourselves aren't welcome, aren't acceptable. So this could be the loud part of ourselves, or this could be the bossy part of ourselves, or the greedy part of ourselves, or the sexual part of ourselves. And what happens is we can actually just start to pretend that they don't exist. We block off them because they're undesirable. We don't want to be abandoned. We don't want to be rejected. Or sometimes we feel guilty about things. Sometimes it is dark things. So sometimes it's somebody might have violent or antisocial desires that they block off. Okay, so what I've put on the list of this can especially include depression, anxiety, anger, guilt, sleep disturbance, physical sensations, changing in sexual arousal patterns, and physical symptoms. Okay, so this is the bit that most people don't get about therapy, okay, is that the therapist, because they engage in a very intense interaction with the client, deep empathy, deep concentration, focusing on what they say, focusing on what they don't say, focusing on their body language, focusing on their facial expressions, focusing, tuning in, really intensely on all of this stuff, okay? What happens is, and obviously, our unconscious stuff, it leaks into our body, leaks into all this kind of stuff, and we pick up on it, okay? So what can happen is we start to experience feelings and sometimes thoughts that aren't ours, belong to the client. So we can come home and find ourselves, feeling quite angry, and we can't actually pin that down. Sometimes it's not unusual to be angry and not know why. Actually, if you really tune into feelings, you'll find there's lots of feelings you can't quite identify, usually because they come from the past. But these are feelings that you think, well, where does that come from? I'm feeling really guilty, but I haven't done anything wrong. And it can be physical symptoms. So you can actually come away with a sore throat. Often, one of the things that we know happens is that we end up mirroring. This is where the mirror neurons do come in. We start mirroring the body language of the client. And when you start to so if somebody's depressed, they usually often have a certain kind of body language, the way they hold themselves. And if you adopt that, you can actually make yourself depressed. So that's a very kind of conscious, overt kind of side of it, but it goes deeper than that. And then the deepest, darkest, most extreme form of this is something called projective identification. Okay, now this is my understanding of it, and I've come across people that describe this, different sources describe this in a completely different way, which kind of leaves me kind of thinking, I haven't understood it, I don't know anything, and I start to go into a imposter syndrome thing. And I think the thing with these kind of psychological things, this is why I call this channel Mark the Demystifier. Often they are explained very badly. People do get the wrong end of the stick. So this is my understanding. If you're a psychoanalyst and this comes from Melanie Klein, who's probably one of the most controversial of the psychoanalysts. But also came up with stuff that's in the language, and you probably, concepts that you kind of use every day without question. So she talked about projective identification, which is a form of projection So what have I written here? This is very similar, but it takes it to the level of behaviour. You start acting in different ways, sometimes very marked and sometimes extremely subtle, but not your normal behaviours. So projective identification. So you come away from the therapy session and you act differently, because you're taking away, you're picking up on, you're absorbing, you're almost like soaking into your system, your psyche, the unspoken, the disowned, the rejected, the hidden parts of the client. Okay. Now, you could say, well, can you not protect yourself? Can you not block all this stuff off? And I think, depending on what kind of school of therapy you do, a lot of people would block this off. But the psychodynamic practitioners don't, because this is the meat and potatoes of the therapy. They pick up this stuff, and then they process it. Okay, so this is the important thing. This is the vital thing for self-preservation, because if you don't process it, it can get very, very kind of toxic. It can make you feel, like I say, all kinds of things. And when I say acting out the behaviours of the client, I'm not talking about sort of like 1970s kind of hammer horror kind of scenario where somebody kind of becomes almost possessed by the client and goes out and commits murders and then kind of doesn't realise that they've done it until the morning, and I love those old films actually, but that's not what it's like. We're talking more kind of subtle stuff here. We're talking I don't know, for example, overeating. You might never overeat, or your sexual behaviours or interests or patterns might change, or you might find yourself becoming more opinionated, or it's those kind of things. It's that kind of stuff. Okay, so one of the things I wrote on the notes is others are likely to spot this before you do, because that's why therapy works, because one person can kind of spot this in another, particularly a trained therapist, particularly an analyst. They're trained to. Oops, sorry, banging the camera. They're trained to really observe this stuff meticulously, and sometimes often the training is about 7 years, and it includes having your own therapy and analysis. Psychoanalysis, it's among other things was famous for it being often a treatment that you would have something like 4 times a week, because that way the analyst can really kind of pick up on and experience all this kind of stuff. So the job of the analyst is to work with this stuff. This is their bread and butter, although earlier I said it was their meat and potatoes. I'm mixing my culinary metaphors. So in a way, they're a lot safer, because they're trained to recognise this stuff, and it's their business to recognise this stuff. But if you're a cognitive behavioural therapist, tautological, you're not necessarily trained. You might be trained a little bit. You might have some training in countertransference or transference, but you're not trained to work on this level. But it doesn't mean it's not there. It's still affecting you. So, in a way, the more aware you are of this stuff, and the more you can recognise it, tune into it, see it, the safer you are, the less likely you're going to experience this unconscious vicarious trauma. So this is for everyone, and this is why, one of the things is who's most vulnerable to vicarious trauma. Well, the people that are most vulnerable to vicarious trauma are probably the people that are going to be exposed to it the most, but not always. Sometimes the people who are exposed to it the most are also trained and skilled at dealing with it. So the people that suffer with it the most are the people that don't experience it. Either don't experience it a lot, and then it comes as a real shock. Like when somebody hears something, from a friend, some horrific story. It can be, like deeply traumatic. And like in clinical settings, often you have administrative, non-clinical staff, and they can't help but, be exposed and to hear some of this material. And it can be more distressing often to them than it is to the clinicians that work with it. So, you can't pretend it's not there. I guess if your mode of working is one that is very cerebral, So the CBT kind of a cognitive behavioural therapy kind of approach, is very collaborative, working with the client. It's kind of, they like to describe it as a kind of like a scientific kind of exploration, like detective work, working on thoughts, identifying thoughts, and doing it all in a very conscious way. You could, to some extent, shut off from your perceptions and your deep connection with the client, but actually therapy works best when there is that deeper connection. So the price of doing that might keep you safer, but it's going to make your therapy far less effective. And who wants to see a therapist of any kind that's not empathic? That's what everyone wants that's what people want from their doctor. That's what they want from, that's what you want from everyone. So this is the subtle mechanisms of this stuff. Now, I actually prefer language, because I used to work with massage. I used to do holistic massage, and I trained in spiritual healing and things like that. So I'm kind of the language that was kind of used in that way of working is more kind of like simple and everyday. So it's more, people would talk about picking up on the client's stuff, and I actually prefer that language to transference and countertransference. What are you picking up from there? Are you going away carrying some of somebody else's stuff? Would be a question that a massage therapist would ask another, because when you work on people's bodies, this kind of thing happens as well, but in a slightly different way, and there's a slightly different conceptualization of it, really, but there's an overlap. So that is what I work. So that is countertransference, and that is one half of vicarious trauma. So the other half of vicarious trauma is content. The other half of vicarious is somebody tells you something horrific. Okay. Now, going back to the context of my video series of why it's a really bad idea to be a psychotherapist, that's another reason to be kind of to be conscious of, is that you will hear things as a psychotherapist or a counsellor, or in lots of other clinical roles as well. So I'm talking about psychotherapy because that's where I come from, but I'm not trying to exclude other professions in this, many of which are very, very similar. You will hear things that will make your hair curl, really, and you have to hold that. You can't, as a therapist, you can't kind of freak out in front of the client. You can react to it in a real way, and sometimes that's very very important, because often the client's denied it. Denial is another psychodynamic kind of process. And somebody that's denied or minimized, somebody talks about the childhood sexual abuse, often they'll minimize it, often they'll talk about it in a very light way. They'll sometimes laugh and smile while they're talking about it. So the therapist, is like, really, that happened to you? That's terrible, But you're not doing that in an uncontrolled way. You're doing that in a way, the message you need to convey to the client is that I can hear this stuff you're telling me. I can hold it safely. You're safe to tell me this stuff. I'm like a kind of a holding space for you to be able to say whatever you want, and I'm able to deal with that. You don't have to worry about me. Okay. But you can respond in a way that reflects maybe their blocked feelings around it. But what you can't do is freak out. You can't be, oh my God, burst into tears and lose the plot. Okay. If you have to, you can do that afterwards. But you have to hold it while you're with the client, and you depend on what field you work in. I mean, I think some counsellors, and I'm quite kind of critical of this actually, but some counsellors and therapists, I think, want to work with, I don't know, it's a slightly pejorative phrase, so but I think it's the best phrase to describe it, really, is they want to kind of work with the word well. They want to work with people who are, generally functioning quite well. They're not people whose lives are falling apart, or who've had horrific, abusive nightmare childhoods. They want to work with somebody that's got a little bit of mild anxiety or a bit of mild depression, and they think that that's kind of what it's about. And then if they get exposed to something more serious, and I've heard cases where, people have disclosed to their counsellor, they've gone into counselling, maybe been in counselling for some time, and I use the terms counselling and psychotherapy interchangeably, although there are differences. They may have been talking about, other issues, more day-to-day or more surface issues, and then they develop a trust with the therapist, and they say, oh, well, actually, I've never told anyone this in my whole life, but when I was a child, my father did this to me, my brother did this to me, whatever it might be. And sometimes the therapist can't hold it, and actually he says, well, I can't work with that, I'm not trained in this, I'm not skilled in this, I need to refer you to somebody else. Now, personally, I think that's appalling. I think, if you're going to do therapeutic work with people, you have to be able to follow them wherever they go. And if they go to some dark places, you have to follow them to the dark places as well. The other thing that's really important, I'm coming to an end soon because we're on the 30-minute mark, is there are lots of strategies that all therapists do or should do to keep themselves safe, even if they're not aware of these mechanisms and they're not trained in spotting this stuff and unpacking it. And that is what we call supervision. So when we talk about supervision, it makes it sound like there's somebody in the room kind of watching you with a clipboard and kind of, looking at the clock and seeing whether you're working hard enough. That supervision in counselling and therapy is not that. That supervision in counselling and psychotherapy is where, on a regular basis, the therapist goes to see another therapist and talks about their work. Because we can't talk about it, down the pub. We can't talk about it to our partners because it's deeply confidential. So we talk about it in a safe, confidential setting. And a good supervisor will not just be, some supervisors kind of think that the job is about telling you what to do. Have you done this? Have you tried that? To me, sometimes that can come in. Suggestions and, ideas can be useful. But actually a really good supervisor, whether they're psychodynamic or not, is one that takes care of the therapist and helps them recognize any unhealthy bits of transference, bits of countertransference, bits of projective identification, any unconscious stuff that they're carrying from the client, and make it conscious. And once you make it conscious, it's like it evaporates. So a supervision session for therapy, a good one is like you physically feel lighter at the end of it. So you might go in kind of feeling quite troubled about something, but not really quite sure what it is. You can't get to the bottom of it. You talk to a good supervisor, and they work with you. It's totally collaborative. They lead you. You explore. Is it this? Is it that? What does it feel like? What's the quality of it all? They like an archaeologist really, working side by side with you. They'll uncover all this kind of thing. And once you're aware of it, it's easy to deal with for the most part. Not always easy to deal with, easier to deal with. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of subtle stuff, really. I mean, maybe I probably should have given some more examples. But if you have any questions, I'm always happy to do kind of follow-on videos if people have questions, and if you want me to kind of give more examples, because sometimes that kind of helps to bring it to life. So I'm going to finish there. So well done for sitting with me kind of yakking about weird stuff for over 30 minutes. If you've enjoyed it, please. So some people are signed up to YouTube, which means you can kind of click the like button and something happens, and it means I kind of get rewarded. I get points. What do points make? Prizes. If you're not actually signed up to YouTube, then nothing will happen. So if you sign up to YouTube, you can also leave a comment. And if you're not signed up to YouTube, then you can't. So if you want to leave a comment, then sign up to YouTube. Also, if you've signed up to YouTube, you can do something even better, which helps me, because this is a channel that I want to grow. And you can do something called subscribing, where you get notifications of any new stuff that I might put out. And it helps me. The more subscribers I get, the more comments I get, the more likes I get, the more YouTube shows this video to more people. At the moment, I'm kind of buried. If you actually kind of Google Mark Lindsay Early Vicarious Trauma, why it's not a good idea to be a psychotherapist, this probably won't come up. But once I get lots of likes and comments and stuff like that, and more subscribers, particularly when you get over the 1,000 mark, which I'm nearly there at the moment, they start to show it to more and more people, and that's the what I want to do, because the main purpose of this channel is to help people by putting some useful information It actually makes people feel better and improves the quality of people's lives. So anything you do along those lines, I'm deeply grateful. I hope it's been interesting. If you think I've got anything wrong or you want to challenge anything, that's fantastic. The rules of that are to be polite. Because discussions like this are supposed to be beneficial for everyone that takes part in them and enjoyable. But there are people on YouTube that think that if you disagree with somebody, you should call them names. Which is another topic in itself. So polite and convivial discussion is always welcome. You don't have to agree. I particularly like it when people disagree, and we can have a good discussion and we can all learn from it. So I am going to say goodbye. Thank you for watching, and check out the rest of the series if you haven't already. Thank you very much. Rangimarie.